Hello and welcome to this tutorial brought to you by Codelabs Academy. If you're new to React.js and you're trying to figure out how to manage the state of your components in your application, this video is for you. In this video, we'll create a simple wish bucket app. This is a very simple application to keep track of your wish list or bucket list. So in this application, we can list wishes, we can add wishes, and we can remove them too. Let's start by scaffolding our React.js application. So if you don't know much about React, we can use the React Create App CLI to scaffold a fresh React.js app. Type in npx create React app, then the name of the application, and then hit enter. And the React.js CLI is going to scaffold this fresh new React.js project for you. I have this done already, so let's skip ahead and go to VS Code. This is the project we get by running React.js CLI. Now, the default file structure looks something like this. We can make this project cleaner by deleting some files that we won't need in this tutorial. For example, I won't need this app.test.js, I will not need this logo.svg, this file too, and this one. I can just delete them. And now we can continue on creating our application. We also need to open up the index.js file and delete these two lines. So the import statement for report web vitals, we don't need it anymore. And I'm going to delete this too. Okay, cool. React.js is all about components, right? So let's create a new folder here inside the source folder and call it components. Now, in this folder, I'm going to create a new file called wishlist. Now, this is the component that we're going to use to render out our list of wishes. I can use React.js snippets to create a simple React functional component by typing React functional component. So RFC. I hit enter, and here's my component. Let's save this for now and head to app.js. Now, inside app.js, we've deleted logo earlier, so I don't need this import statement. And I'm going to delete everything inside the div with the class name of app. So this is my main component. This is the app component. Cool. Now all I need to do is to import the wishlist component that we have just created and render it out inside my app component. So this is going to be our main component, and we're going to include all other extra components inside of this div. So let's do that right now. Now, what I need to do is to import the wishlist component inside this app component and render it out using JSX. So I'm going to add the component as a JSX element, just like this. So wish list. And when I hit enter, this file is going to get auto imported in the app.js file. Awesome. Now let's give this a test and take a look at how our application is looking so far. So we need to open up the terminal again and type yarn start to start the development server. I'm going to hit enter, and here is our application. So all we can see now is this wishlist text. Okay, now this is coming from the wishlist component. Okay, so if I change this to wish bucket, I'm going to see wish bucket here. Awesome. So let's create a new variable called data, and this variable is going to hold a list of wish items. So this is my list item, and this is my variable data. Now, ideally, what we want to do in this wish list is to render out all these wishes. So we're not going to render out the ID, but we are going to need to render out this title. Now, to render out the list of data, we can do something like this. So we're using the map array method, which will call a simple callback function on each element of an array. And the array we're using this time is the data array, which contains our list of items. So for each item, We're creating a new paragraph and including the wish title as text for this paragraph. So if we take a look at how this will render, we're going to see something like this. So we see the first title, the second, and the third. Cool. Now, this could not be actually used in React.js. Now, this is not a valid way to maintain or manage your state in React.js applications, because normally variables disappear when the function exits, but state variables are preserved by React.js. State variables are a local state, which is perhaps the easiest kind of state to manage in React. Considering there are so many tools built into the core React library for managing it, each individual component can have its own state. This is sometimes referred to as local state. Now, useState is the first tool you should reach for to manage state in your components. It can take any valid data value, including primitive and object values. Additionally, it has a setter function that can be passed down to other components as a callback function. Now, to create a local state for this component, we need to use the useState hook. So useState, I'm going to hit enter, and this useState hook is going to get auto-imported from React library, like this. So just make sure this is imported too. Now, using this hook, it actually declares a state variable for this component. Now, we're going to name our variable wishes, but we could call it anything else. But first, what do we pass to useState as an argument? The only argument to the useState hook is the initial state. Now, as an initial state, we have this data array. So let's use this. Cool. Now, what does useState actually return? It returns a pair of values. The first one is the current state, and the second one is a function that updates the current state. This is why we write something like this. So we need to use the destructuring syntax to grab the two values. The first one is going to be wishes, okay, the current state, and the second one is going to be a function that updates this current state. This function is going to be called set, and then the name of the current state. So set wishes. Now this is going to be equal this useState, and we're using the initial state, this array here. So once this gets called, this is going to return two values. The first one is the current state, and the second one is a function that updates this current state. Now we're using the destructuring syntax to grab both values and assign a variable to each of them. Now that we know what the useState hook does, our example should make more sense. So far, we're actually using the map array method on the data array. Let's switch this to use the current state that we get from the useState hook. Like this. I'm going to save the file and take a look at the browser. So we still have the same result, but now we have a state that can be managed by our component. So once the component actually exits, this state is not going to be removed. Now let's make things more interesting, and instead of returning a simple paragraph, let's return a different component. Now I'm going to create a new component, and I'm going to call this wish.js. Again, this is a simple React functional component, so let's create that. Instead of returning just a wish text, let's return something like this. So we're going to return a heading, and inside of this heading, we're going to type in or render out the title of each wish. And then we want to have another button. So for example, this button can be used to remove the wish from the list. And let's give this parent div a class name. The class is going to be wish. I have already prepared some stylings for this class name wish. And we are going to pass each wish item as a prop. So let's include the props too. And in our case, we're going to have a prop as wish. Now let's go back to wish list. And instead of returning this paragraph, let's return our newly created component. So this component is going to be wish. And since we have added a prop here, and we're going to use this prop instead of title, we're going to type wish.title. Cool. So we're grabbing the title from each wish, but we need to pass this prop here. And we're going to pass this like this and type in wish. Cool. Now let's take a look at how this will look like. Cool. Now we can see our items, okay, from the wish list, and we can see the button to remove each list item. Now instead of this remove text, let's add an SVG or an icon. Let's go back to wish, and instead of remove, I'm going to paste this SVG. Take a look. Now this looks much better. I think our application could use a navbar, right? So let's create one. I'm going to create new component. Oops. So navbar.js. Again, this is a simple React function component. Now, instead of returning this div with navbar text, let's return another semantic element. Let's return a nav, and inside this nav, let's add the name of our application, for example. And the second thing I want to add is maybe the number of wishes we have in our list. So ideally, we want to have something like this. Wishes, and then maybe 4 or maybe 3. I don't know. This is going to be dynamic. Now I need to include this navbar inside my main component, which is app.js. Now, before wishlist, let's add the navbar component. Cool. Let's take a look. This is how our application looks like now. Now, here's a question. How can we get the number of wishes inside my bucket list and render that number out on the navbar? Should we add a navbar inside wishlist and then use that data and pass it as a prop? Or should we use it, or should we lift up the state so we get all this state from wishlist and take it to app.js, paste it here, for example, and then use this state inside navbar, inside wishlist, or maybe any other component? Now, usually you will pass information from parent component to a child component via props. But passing props can become verbose and inconvenient if you have to pass them through many components in the middle, or if many components in your app need the same information. So wouldn't it be great if there were a way to teleport data to the components in the tree without passing props? Other than Redux, we can create a simple global state in React using the Context API too. Now, context lets the parent component make some information available to any component in the tree below it, no matter how deep, without passing it explicitly through props. So let's see this in action. First thing we need to do is to create a new folder here, and we call this folder context. Let's create a new file inside context folder and call this wish provider.js. Now, inside this file, we need to export two things. The first thing is we need to create this context and export the variable containing this context. So let's do this. I'm going to type export const wish context. This is the variable I'm creating, and we're going to create a new context and save it, store it in this variable. So this is the first thing we need to do. The other thing we need to export from this file is the wish provider. So again, let's create this. Now this is going to be a simple arrow function, and this arrow function is going to return something, okay? But first, this wish provider is going to contain the state or the new data for our application. So in our case, instead of having the state and the data in the wish list, I'm going to teleport this, get it out from wish list, and add it to the provider, just like this. Now, the wish provider that we are exporting here is going to be used as the component that will hold all the data and pass it to other children, right? Now, when you use React.js and you create a new functional component, because this is just a simple function component too. And I also said that Context API is when you create this provider, it's just like creating a new component that will act as a global state. So this component doesn't have to do anything with rendering the UI. All this component does is to contain some data and pass it around to other children. Now, what we need to return is the wish context.provider component. So this is just a simple component, just like we use navbar and wishlist. This is another component too. Now, the other thing this component needs is to include the children of this component. We're doing this so that when we use this component outside of this file, any other child component included inside of it is going to get rendered out here. So we need to grab the default prop, which is children, from here. So I'm just going to type children. And another thing we need is to pass the value that we need for other children. The other thing you need to include in this component is the value or the piece of data you want to pass to these children. In our case, we're going to pass two things. First, we want to pass these wishes, which is the current state, and we want to pass the function that sets the current state too. Now, we pass this as an array. So wishes and set wishes. Cool. Now our wish provider is ready to be used or consumed by other components. Now for other components to be able to use or consume these values we're passing, these components must be included as children of this wish context. Since this is returned from the wish provider, all we need to do is to include the wish provider here. So I'm going to add the wish provider and include all children that needs that data inside of it. Awesome. Now all I need to do is to consume this data, whether it's wishes or use the function that sets the current wishes or the current state to another state. So let's see this in action and head back to navbar again. Now inside of navbar, instead of adding this for, what I want to add is the length of the wishes array, because basically the length of the wishes array is the number of wishes we have in that list. Now to use the context that we have created and to use that global state, we need to use another hook called use context. So I'm importing it from React again, and use context actually accepts an argument. The argument that we need to pass is the context that we have created earlier, remember? Now if I go back to context, I created this context and assigned it to a new variable, and I'm exporting this variable. So what I can do is to grab that wish context variable that I'm exporting, and this hook is now going to return to us both values that we're passing in the provider. So to grab these values again, we need to assign them or destructure the return value using the destructuring syntax like this. So first is going to be wishes, the second value is going to be set wishes. So this is the function to update the current state or the wishes that we have. Now instead of for, let's make this dynamic. Now I can do something like this. I can output the length of this array. So I can type wishes dot length, excuse me. Awesome. Now before we go and take a look, remember that we have removed the state from wishlist. So instead of using wishes, which we don't have right now, we need to grab the same values from the provider again on wishlist component too. So all I need to do is to use context again to grab the values that we are getting from the provider and then using these values. In our case right now, we're using the wishes array, again, the current state passed from the wish provider, and we're using the map array method to use a callback function for each element inside the wishes array and printing out the wish component. We're passing the same wish, so we're passing each element to the wish component so we can create again this component and we can render out the title and the button with the delete icon. So let's save everything and go take a look. I think we need to import wish context here again. So yeah, this one. Take a look and you can see now that we have wishes 3 and we have 3 list items. To make sure everything works okay, we still haven't added a way to add a new task. So just let's go to the wish provider and duplicate, for example, this one. So like this ID is going to be 4. Now, after adding a new list item or new wish to our data or to our state, this should become 4 once we, So now this is 4 and we're getting 4 list items instead of 3. We've seen how we can use the first, how to use the first value we're getting from the provider, which is the current state. Let's see how we can use the second value, which is the function to update the current state. So let's create a new component for this. I'm going to create a new component called addWish.js. It's going to be a React functional component, and instead of a div, let's return a form. Excuse me. Inside the form, we need 2 things. First is an input with type text to type in the new wish that we want to include to the list. The second thing is a new input type submit to submit our newly created wish. Now we need to add this wish to the app.js. So we need to add the component to the main component so we can see it in the browser. I'm going to add this right after the navbar. So I'm going to type add wish. It's going to get auto imported. So let's save the file, take a look, and we can see now the input and the button to submit that input. Now this actually doesn't do anything right now, so we need something, or we need to include more functions. We need to include a functionality to actually type something here, click on the button. This task is going to get added to the wish list. So we're going to set new state. We're going to update the current state. So let's do this. Let's go back to addWish. The first thing we need here is a local state to keep track of the text inside this input. So we're going to use useStateHook and to use as an initial state an empty string, and the value that this will return is a title, okay, and the function to set this state, which is title, or update it. And the second thing we will need is a function to actually update this title that we're going to use. As a function, we can use update title, which will take the event as an argument, and we're just setting a new title for this. So we're using the function to update the current state, the title state, and as a value, we're using whatever value is actually added to this input. Now we have a small error here because we're not importing useState, so let's import this. And we need to add 2 things in our input. First, value needs to reflect the title that we have just created. And we'll need to add a new event, which is onChange. Now, every time we type something, we want to execute this function, update title. To do this, all we need to do is to call it out here. So update title, and that's it. Let's go back, try to type something. And for now, we won't see anything, but just bear with me for just a second, and we will add the add task functionality. Now, when we type something to that input and we click the submit button, whatever we type on that input should actually be added as a new wish item to the wish list that we have in the context or the provider. Now remember, our context provider is providing two values. First is the current state for wishes, and the second one is a function that updates the current state. Now we need a function to do all this stuff. We need a function that will execute whenever we hit the submit button, and it will take the title and add the new wish item and push it to the current state. So here's the function we're going to use. This add wish function, which also accepts the event as an argument. Now first we need to prevent the default behavior of the browser. So when you submit something to the browser in a form, the default behavior is that the browser will refresh the page. We don't want that to happen. That's why we're including this line. The second thing is this. So you see we're using the set wishes, which is the function we get from the wish provider, the second one, to update the wishes. Now we're using this function, and we're using as a callback function. This is what we're doing. We're grabbing like the previous state or previous wishes. This is something included with React.js. So whenever you use a setter, you can use the previous state inside the setter for the callback function. So all we are doing is using the destructuring syntax to spread out the previous state. So spreading out the previous state means that we're creating a new array including all the previous states, so all the previous wish items. And after this comma, we're adding a new wish item to that state. So we grab all the previous state, put it here, spread it out, and then add another item. And this is going to happen every time you type something in the input and then hit the submit button. So our new wish item is going to be really simple. First, the title is going to be the same as the title we have, or the text inside the input. And the ID is going to be whatever ID the last item in our state plus 1. So previous wish is the previous array or the previous state that we have. Now we're grabbing something by its index, right? That's why we're using this bracket syntax. Now the index we're using is this, the previous wishes dot length. So the previous wishes list has 4 items. Now the length should be 4. Now -3 means that the item with index 3. Now if we go to a wish provider, this is going to be index 0, this is going to be index 1, this is going to be index 2, and this is going to be index 3. So basically whatever ID we get from the last item, in our case, or the first case, it's going to be 4. We're just adding 1 to that ID. Cool. Now we need to use this add wish in our input whenever you click on this input. So the event is going to be on click, and whenever you click this button, we're going to execute this function. So we're going to execute add wish. Now, before we go test this out, remember, we're using the set wishes, which is a function that can be only grabbed from the global state, right? Now we need to consume that provider that we have created again, just like we're doing this in the navbar and in the wish list. So this is the best thing about Context API. You just create the data in one place, provide it to all other children, and basically all components in between can use or consume this value too. So I'm going to add this on the top. We're already using set wishes. Cool. Now just make sure that you're importing wish context too. We're importing use context and the wish context both. Cool. Now let's try this out. Let's refresh the page. Let's try adding a new task. Or new wish, something simple, add task, and boom, we have the new wish here, and we see that wishes is also updated. So what's happening here? First, we type something, new wish. When you click add task, this function is going to get executed. So this function is going to use the setter for wishes, the global state that we have created, and it's going to push whatever you create here or whatever you type here to that global state. And to make sure that this is working, the navbar is grabbing the current state from the context, and we're using the length of the current state. So once we click on add task, the current state is going to get updated. But the cool thing is this, all consumers of this state provided by the context, if the value updates, all consumers are going to be re-rendered again. So let's see this again. I'm going to click on add task. This state is going to get updated, the global state, the context state, and this consumer, the navbar, is going to get re-rendered again. So task added to the list updated, and component re-rendered again. Cool, now we can create and add a new wish item to our global state, but we can't delete anything from that. So let's do this next. We need to go to wish.js component, which is where we're creating the button to delete something. Now, what we need is the functionality to do so. So the first thing we need is a simple function that uses the same set wishes function to update the global state. Again, just like when adding the wish, we're using the same function. So we're manipulating the state in the context, or the state that gets provided to us using this function. This remove wish is going to get executed whenever we click on this button. So we're going to type on click, execute remove wish. Cool. Now there's a problem here. We could not find name wishes. This array could not be found. So what we need is to actually export it from the provider too. And actually not just this array, also the second function, the second value from use context. So let's do this again. We use context to consume the context that we have created, or the global state that we have created. Now what we want to consume is actually the wish context. Now this will return two values, right? First is the current state, so wishes, which is our current state, an array that contains all the wish items. And the second thing is the function to update this current state. I think now we're ready to test this out. What is the problem? Wish.js needs an ID. This is really easy to fix. Now we just need to change this to item, and this is going to be wish.id. Now what we're doing here is pretty simple. We're using the set wishes, the function to update the current state, and as an argument we're using a filter array method. Now filter array method will execute a callback function on each item of that array. Now this filter method, it's going to check a condition, and it's going to return the item if that condition is true, and delete that item if that condition is not true. So for the first item, for example, the first item is going to be ID1. Let's say we're trying to delete ID4 or ID2. So the first item is going to be ID1. ID1 doesn't equal ID2, which is true. So this statement is going to evaluate to true. Thus, this item is going to get returned in a new array. So basically, this array method will allow us to check something by an ID and delete it from, not just an ID, check any condition basically and delete an item basing on that condition. In our case, we're checking for IDs, which is something unique in our items, that's why. Let's take a look and try this out. Let's create a new wish, so new wish. And let's try to delete it. We have 5, we should see 4 right now. Cool. Awesome. So now we have our little application running nicely. So let's just have a quick recap here. We're creating the global state using Context API. And to use Context API first, you need to create a context. and that context is going to get created, assigned to a variable, and we're exporting this variable. The second thing is the wish provider. Now, wish provider is responsible for two things. First, the wish provider contains the data we want to actually provide to other consumers. And the second thing is the return statement that we are adding here. So we're returning a simple component. This is a special component for the provider. This is where we pass values to children to use it. And basically, whenever you use this wish provider, all children are going to get included inside, and they are going to be able to use the values you're passing. In our example, navbar can use these values, addWish can use these values, and wishlist can use these values too. Now, there are some couple things I want to talk about. First, the use cases for Context API. Now, if your app lets the user change its appearance, example, there's dark mode, light mode, you can put a context provider at the top of your app and use that context in components that need to adjust their visual look. A second thing is that many components might need to know the currently logged in user. So putting it in context make it convenient to read it anywhere in the tree. Some apps also let you operate multiple accounts at the same time. Example, to leave a comment as a different user. In those cases, it can be convenient to wrap a part of the UI into a nested provider with a different current account value. So this is just some use examples or use cases for Context API. But in general, if some information is needed by distant components in different parts of the tree, it's a good indication that context will help you. Now, before we finish up this video, here's a quick note. A component calling useContext will always re-render when the context value changes. So all consumers of a certain context, they're going to get re-rendered whenever those values inside that context get updated. Cool. Okay, so I hope you've learned something useful today, and if you've enjoyed today's video, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our page. If you're interested in learning more about web development, front-end, back-end, React.js, you name it, you can go and check out Codelabs Academy. So Codelabs Academy actually is a bootcamp provider that provides many courses for many programs. We have cybersecurity, data science, UX UI design, web development. We also provide so many courses too. If you're interested in our upcoming workshops, you can register for free if you go to this workshops page. And basically, just check all the upcoming workshops and just register to any one that you might be interested in. If you felt like you enjoyed today's video, you can feel free to register for the free upcoming workshop about managing global state in React using Redux Toolkit. Now, Redux Toolkit is pretty advanced and has a lot of advantages in comparison with Context API. I'm really excited to present this upcoming workshop. If you're really interested, I hope I see you there. Otherwise, if you want to apply or to ask more about the programs that we provide, feel free to either go to contact us or apply directly, and you will hear from one of our teachers or operation manager. And thanks a lot for tuning in today. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.